All right, so you want to get a good grasp on something, right? Like really understand it and quickly. That's what we're doing here.
Definitely. And today is all about antibiotics, specifically how they're used in medicine.
Yeah, we've got some really interesting research here on pharmaceutical biotechnology, so we're going beyond the basic stuff. Like, forget just skimming the surface. This is a deep dive into the stuff you really need to know.
It's fascinating, honestly. We're talking way more than just your typical take this when you have an infection kind of thing.
Right, so let's start with the obvious one.
Hmm.
Treating bacterial infections. That's the main thing antibiotics are known for.
Absolutely. That's their bread and butter. Essentially, antibiotics work by messing with the key processes that bacteria need to survive, like to
Mhm.
grow and multiply.
Okay, so they're basically disrupting their, like, life support system.
Exactly. Imagine targeting their ability to build their cell walls, make proteins, or even copy their DNA.
So it's like really getting in there and stopping them from functioning.
Mm.
So I'm guessing it's not as simple as just grabbing any antibiotic off the shelf then.
Oh, not at all. Choosing the right antibiotic is a pretty involved process. First off, you need to figure out exactly which bacteria is causing the problem.
Yes.
You know, nail down the culprit.
Right, identify it.
Yeah. Then you need to know if that bacteria is actually susceptible to a particular antibiotic.
Oh.
I mean, there's no point in using one that won't work.
Makes sense.
And then where the infection is actually located in the body plays a role too.
Like if it's in the lungs versus somewhere else.
Exactly. And on top of all that, you have to consider the individual's health things like allergies, how their organs are functioning, their age, whether they're pregnant. All these factors can influence the choice of antibiotic.
Wow, so many things to think about.
There's one more big thing too. We also have to think about the antibiotic spectrum of activity.
Spectrum.
Yeah, basically how broad or narrow its target is. Like, does it kill a wide range of bacteria or is it more specialized?
Got it. So different antibiotics have different targets within the bacteria, right? Could you give us a rundown of some of the main ones?
Sure thing. So for disrupting the bacterial cell wall, we have a couple of major players. There are the beta-lactams like penicillins and cephalosporins,
Right, those are common ones.
and then there's vancomycin. Think of these as the ones that interfere with the bacteria's construction crew, preventing them from building strong walls.
Makes sense. So what about the ones that mess with protein synthesis?
Ah, yes. Protein synthesis is how bacteria make their essential components. For that, we've got aminoglycosides, tetracyclines, macrolides, which include the zithromycin, by the way, clindamycin, and linezolid. Quite a few there.
Wow, yeah, so they're basically stopping the bacteria from building what they need to function.
Exactly. Then we have the ones that target their genetic code, the nucleic acid inhibitors. Those include fluoroquinolones and rifampicin.
Okay, so those are messing with their DNA, basically.
Yeah, you got it. And last but not least, we have sulfonamides and trimethoprim.
What do those do?
These guys disrupt the bacteria's metabolism by messing with their folate production.
Folates.
Yeah, it's a type of B vitamin that bacteria need to survive. Without it, they can't function properly.
Interesting. So we've got a whole arsenal of weapons to fight bacterial infections.
We do.
But now, here's something I found really surprising. Some antibiotics are used to treat cancer.
Yeah, that one often throws people off.
I mean, cancer and bacteria seem totally different. How does that even work?
Well, certain antibiotics have what we call a cytotoxic effect,
Cytotoxic, meaning?
meaning they're toxic to cells, they can kill cells, and they're particularly good at killing cells that are dividing rapidly, like cancer cells.
Oh, I see. So because cancer cells are constantly growing and dividing, these antibiotics can target them specifically?
That's the idea. And the main way they do this is by interfering with the cancer cell's DNA.
Okay, but how? What are they actually doing to the DNA?
Well, there are a few different mechanisms. Take anthracyclines, for instance.
Like doxorubicin.
Exactly. Doxorubicin is an anthracycline. They have this interesting way of working. They can actually wedge themselves into the DNA strands. Picture it like jamming a zipper.
So they're physically getting in the way of the DNA?
Yep. And not only that, but they also mess with an enzyme called topoisomerase II.
Topoisomerase. What does that do?
It helps manage the DNA tangles. You see, DNA strands are super long and can get all twisted up. Topoisomerase helps keep things organized. But anthracyclines disrupt that process, leading to even more problems for the cancer cell.
Wow, that's pretty devious.
Oh, and they also produce these damaging molecules called reactive oxygen species, ROS for short, which can cause further damage within the cell.
Triple whammy. So what other examples are there?
We've got actinomycin D. It also inserts itself into the DNA, but its main action is to block the instructions from being read. Basically, it stops the DNA from being transcribed into RNA, which the cell needs to make proteins.
So it's like cutting off the communication line.
Precisely. Then you have bleomycin. This one's more direct. It actually causes breaks in the DNA strands.
So it's like physically chopping up the DNA?
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And finally, we have mitomycin C. This one acts as a DNA alkylating agent.
Alkylating.
It means it adds these bulky chemical groups to the DNA, which basically creates roadblocks that prevent the DNA from functioning properly.
So all of these anti-tumor antibiotics are basically attacking the cancer cell's DNA in different ways,
That's right.
and they're used by themselves.
Typically, no. These drugs are usually part of a combination chemotherapy regimen.
So they're used alongside other cancer treatments.
Exactly. And they're used for a variety of cancers, including leukemias, lymphomas, and solid tumors.
Okay, so that's a whole other way antibiotics can be used beyond just fighting infections.
It is. It really highlights how powerful and versatile these drugs are.
Now, I know our sources also mention using antibiotics to prevent infections, not just treat existing ones.
Right, that's called prophylactic use. It's basically giving antibiotics to people who are at high risk of developing an infection even before they show any symptoms.
When would you do that?
Well, a common example is surgical prophylaxis.
So giving antibiotics before surgery.
Exactly. A dose of cefazolin, for instance, before a surgery, can significantly lower the risk of getting an infection at the surgical site.
That makes sense.
Of course, the specific antibiotic choice depends on the type of surgery and the bacteria that are likely to be present.
Right, because different bacteria are susceptible to different antibiotics.
Precisely. Another instance is during certain dental procedures in patients who have certain heart conditions.
Heart conditions.
Yeah, folks with some heart issues are at higher risk of developing a serious infection called endocarditis if they have certain dental procedures.
Endocarditis, that's an infection of the heart, right?
Exactly. So to prevent that, we might give them antibiotics like amoxicillin,
Okay.
or if they're allergic to penicillin, we might use clindamycin or azithromycin instead.
So it's all about preventing that heart infection.
Exactly. And we also use prophylactic antibiotics in people with weakened immune systems.
Like folks with HIV or people who've had organ transplants.
Exactly. In those cases, a drug like TMP-SMX can help prevent opportunistic infections, like pneumocystis pneumonia. Pneumocystis pneumonia. That's a serious lung infection, right?
It is, especially for those with compromised immune systems.
So the antibiotics help protect them from that.
They do. And one more example. After close contact with someone who has meningococcal meningitis, we might give rifampicin to prevent the infection from spreading.
Wow, so many different scenarios where antibiotics can be used preventatively.
There are, but it's important to remember that prophylactic use should be targeted and short-term.
Why is that?
Well, for one, we want to minimize the risk of antibiotic resistance.
Right, because the more we use antibiotics, the more likely bacteria are to develop resistance.
Exactly. And we also want to avoid unnecessary side effects from the antibiotics.
Makes sense. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about using antibiotics to treat existing bacterial infections.
By targeting their essential machinery. Right, like their cell walls, protein synthesis, and DNA. And then we talked about their surprising role in fighting cancer.
By disrupting the DNA of cancer cells.
And finally, their use in preventing infections in vulnerable individuals. That's quite a range of applications.
It is. It really highlights just how important and versatile these drugs are in medicine.
Absolutely, and I think it leaves us with a really important question to think about. Given all these diverse uses of antibiotics, what do you see as the biggest challenges in making sure they stay effective in the future? Especially with this whole issue of antibiotic resistance looming over us.
That's a great question, and it's something we all need to consider.
I think that's a good place to leave it for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure. It's been a great discussion.